Hey, everybody, we are so glad that you are joining us for this fantastic monthly podcast where we talk about all things space. Liftoff is kind of a spin-off with conversations for the future, but it's really cool because we have a Fab Four host group. We like to call ourselves sometimes the astronauts of this mission to get things going. And so we'll go around just in case this is your first time joining, talk a little bit about who we are as your hosts. We'll introduce our guests. We'll talk a little bit about the topic for this week. But the best part is it's all space, it's real, and we love to get the facts out there and let you make the decisions for yourself. So I'll start myself. My name is Meredith Garofalo. You might know me as Rocket Girl. I have been a broadcast meteorologist and space and science correspondent in the local national media for the last 16 years. And now I do more freelance work that allows me also to do more digital content creating for companies like NASA. I also write for space.com. I do mentoring for science journalists and also help out space companies when it comes to communications and public relations, because as we know, that is such an important thing in the industry. So we're so glad you're here. Daniel, I'll let you introduce us. We always like to call him Dr. Plant. Just have some fun, right? Everyone's got a little nickname.
Yeah, so doctor of plant medicine, basically an agricultural scientist, so plant pathology, entomology, soil and water science, but more importantly, how to do this in the future, which includes space. So how to do these things in space is increasingly more relevant to how we are going to sustain here on Earth. So also the founder of Grow Mars, a company working on solving this challenge. Ubaldo?
Hello, hello. Yes, thank you. It's good to see everybody. Ubaldo the Space Ace Ciminieri. I am Chief of Staff at Cislunar Industries. Here's our reps. I'm repping the shirt today. And yeah, just if a fellow communicator on this journey with this great team to just to bring a lot of these conversations to the forefront. Meredith, you said it perfectly. Like we need more voices. We need more people to know what we're doing. And I think this episode in particular is going to be really interesting because of, the election, that's coming up, but also just how we mirror or not mirror, but how we match up our efforts to take humanity as a community into space with just the processes and the procedures and the laws and the politics and all the things that we have to play along with and play nicely with a lot of the times. Like how do we match those things up? So it's going to be a really awesome conversation. All right. Now we're going to turn it over to Meredith for the Rocket Girl Report. I hand it to you, Meredith.
Thanks so much, Ubaldo. And the Rocket Girl Report, kind of a little fun play on my career, but also getting out those hot topics or those big topics that we're going to be focusing on. And so for this week, we were kind of mentioning a little bit about, the focus of this. And, the big thing is we're going to be navigating the politics of the space industry without bringing the politicians into it per se. So the big question that we're trying to answer is how do we keep moving forward to achieve our goals no matter who is in office, and particularly with such polarizing figures as we have this year. We know it's a big topic, but we know we've also got big topics in big organizations. So joining me for the Rocket Girl Report this week, we have Scott McLaughlin. Scott is a highly experienced engineer and executive with a diverse background in both design and business. He has worked in both the private and government sectors and also has traveled around the world installing, maintaining, and marketing specialized wind radar systems. His innovative design supports space launch, test ranges, aviation operations, weather service networks, atmospheric research, pollution studies, and shipboard-based wind measurements. Users include research and defense agencies such as NASA, NOAA, the Department of Education, U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, U.S. Air Force, universities, as well as customers in Spain, Taiwan, India, UAE, Thailand, Kuwait, Mexico, Samoa, and Colombia. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. We're happy to have you.
Very glad to be here. Thanks. I think I need to shorten my intro for you next time.
I think it's fantastic, right? I mean, everybody deserves that chance to have a little bit of a background history of who's coming to the table for the conversation. And so why don't we start off with talking a little bit about your involvement with the space industry and what you're doing at Spaceport America.
Yeah, so Spaceport America, for people who don't know, is what's called a commercial spaceport. A commercial spaceport is something brand new that before 1984, when the Commercial Space Launch Act was passed in Congress, you couldn't have commercial spaceports. You couldn't even have a company like SpaceX, right? Nobody could build their own rocket and launch it. This was a federal activity. So everybody talks about SpaceX and Blue Origin and Rocket Lab and moving forward to where we are now with so many launch providers, but we also need launch sites. And Spaceport America was something that was talked about in the 90s and studied in New Mexico. And eventually there was this thing called the Ansari X Prize, which was this contest to get to space twice in 2 weeks. And of course, Scale Composites won that and partnered later with Sir Richard Branson to create Virgin Galactic. And then our governor partnered with Virgin Galactic. And we were able, because we were ready to build a spaceport, we were ready to make that partnership. And so that Spaceport America, was developed in 2005, 2006. And has been slowly building up steam. So that's what I'm the executive director for that spaceport. We're actually an agency of the state of New Mexico. So I work for the state of New Mexico. And then we have tenants like Virgin Galactic, Spin Launch, we have AeroVironment, and we're getting more and more people out at that site doing all kinds of different tests, aviation and space. And so our future is really going to be orbital launch. And so this topic we're talking about is really big for us. Could we think in about 10 years or somewhere along the line, we'll be able to do inland orbital launch. It will be safe enough, reliable enough that you can fly over parts of the United States. And right now our license is for horizontal and vertical, but we also are working on a reentry license. So we're looking to have perhaps the Sierra Dream Chaser land here, or the Boeing capsule, which actually landed just over the mountain from us at White Sands Space Harbor and White Sands Missile Range. It could land with us instead, or Varda, who is going to do manufacturing in space. So we think we're in a really good position to play a big role as we start moving a lot of cargo and a lot of stuff to space and bringing it back again.
And you've been around, you mentioned, for almost 20 years now, coming up on next year. There have been different administrations, we're talking about, how politics play a role. Have there been some ways it has benefited you over the last 20 years, or there have been some challenges that you face that you hope can be addressed with this next administration coming in?
Well, that's an interesting question. There's two parts of that. There's actually three parts of that. There's local politics, there's state politics, and there's federal politics. And any modern spaceport has to consider all of that. Michigan has been looking at a spaceport. Maine has Camden, Georgia. Those are very localized county stuff plus the state stuff, and then federal. Well, at the federal level, we have gotten virtually no money at all and virtually no support. The only support we've gotten at a federal level is because we're under the airspace of U.S. Army White Sands Missile Range. And because of the Commercial Space Launch Act, which allows for excess capacity to be used for private enterprise, that they cooperate with us to use that airspace for the things we do. But other than that, a very key, important, critical partnership, the federal legislation and federal politics have really not done much for us. What we're looking at, though, is the hurricane is a good reminder. If that hurricane had went a little the other direction, what would the Cape be doing right now in terms of launching every 3 days? They probably wouldn't be doing that anymore. Vandenberg can't take all the freight, neither can Wallops. So there is now an intense look at inland spaceports, and can inland spaceports handle some of this load, so you have a diversity of launch sites and a resilience for space. So we are starting to get noticed as a potential launch site, but over that 20 years we've gotten very little. In fact, I think we've been thought of as just a little thing, with Virgin Galactic. But what we're going to see next year with Virgin Galactic, for example, is they will be working up to 2 launches a week. Those are space launches. Those are licensed FAA licensed launches, and they're bringing, passengers, space flight participants, astronauts to space. So we're very quickly getting to the point where we're very active as a spaceport, which for a commercial spaceport, an inland one is actually a really big deal. But at the federal level, not so much have we had that much interaction.
And it's really good to hear that, Scott, because I think a lot of people don't realize that. I mean, you hear about the funding and the government and government shutdowns and all that, but you don't think about how some of that extra funding is going to help these companies like yours that are going to be crucial, especially now that we're seeing more of these commercial launches and we're seeing more commercial companies that are rising up. So what would you need as far as support would go Perhaps if we look ahead with this next administration, what would you need to be able to hit those goals, hit those dreams, and really move forward and take a jump ahead to achieve what you need to?
I think the first thing we need is a strategy. If you go and you look at the NASA website, and there's a NASA website that talks about deficiencies in the private sector for dealing with space, you won't find anything about spaceports. The assumption is baked in that everything they need to do will happen at the Cape, and they don't need to worry about launches, right? U.S. Space Force has been thinking that way for a while, and they're now starting to think again about diversity of launch sites. But they're not putting any money behind it that we've seen, and they're not putting a strategy behind it that would help. For example, again, I work for the state of New Mexico, but a private company that wants to deal with launches could come to the spaceport and build a launch site. Well, they would need to know that there's a marketplace. They would need to know that the federal government is going to fund some of these launches for satellite replacement if we're in a time of conflict and we have problems with keeping our satellites on orbit, for example. That overall strategy has never been released in terms of what does a network of commercial spaceports look like, and what is needed for the commercial sector to do the manufacturing and taking people to space, taking commodities to space, and what is needed at the national security level for the same thing. Like, what does the country need? Again, it's just a baked-in assumption that they'll always be able to launch at the Cape or at Wallops or Vandenberg or Alaska, but those are all coastal sites. Those are all vulnerable sites if we're in a time of conflict, or if there's some other hurricane or some other natural disaster. So that's the first thing we need is a little more focus on the strategy. The second thing is we think we're in a very good place to play a role as an inland spaceport. So every other spaceport has had tons of federal dollars over the years, and we've had zero. So how do we get some of that to help develop the infrastructure? Not so that the money doesn't go in my pocket. It's just building out the infrastructure so then we can host some of these small to medium-sized rockets, either in the vertical domain or eventually in horizontal launch.
I think you put that so well. I mean, you do think about the different parts of the country. I mean, you're on the coast, you have weather that impacts it. If you think about the West Coast, I mean, earthquakes. I don't think a lot of people think about these things until they actually happen, which is why I think, as horrible as Hurricane Helene was, you think about the lessons learned and if things happening for a reason. And okay, now maybe we do need to get more policy out there, and we do need to start to get this assistance to make sure we have these backup plans in place, just like we all have backup plans in our everyday lives with certain things. I'm going to bring Ubaldo and Daniel in because I know you guys have some great questions for Scott as well, to continue this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, man, it's I never thought about these things to your point, Meredith. Like it's quite fascinating. And so, Scott, I know you've been doing this, but what are some ways that our industry can really step up and come together to help push this conversation further, right? Like, let's be proactive. I mean, we hate to wait for Hurricane Helene, right? Like, how can we come together as a community? What are some things that you've seen work that now that we've got this, this commercial space industry it's really trending upwards, what can we do?
I would say there's two things. On the federal side, launching inland is just going to be a little bit more expensive because you're going to have a rocket that has safe abort modes. You can't just blow it up or let it fall into the ocean, right? It's going to have to maybe stage itself and separate and land, or it's going to have to parachutes, or it's going to have to glide in. So there's some technology improvements both to improve the reliability of launch systems, but also to have them abort when you're not going to make it to orbit. And I don't know how to pay for that, right? Nobody's going to pay for that if you're going to launch over an ocean. You don't need it if you're going to launch over an ocean. You just let it fall into the sea. Not a great plan, but doesn't hurt anybody, right? So on the federal level, we need a marketplace to evolve either from civilian space missions like NASA or DoD that would support that marketplace evolving, knowing, hey, it's going to be more expensive to launch inland. But at a national level, we need that ability. And then the second thing is, if you look at all the rocket providers out there right now, everything about their ground support equipment is different. They use different fuels, they connect differently, the way they launch and count down is different. It's not like an airport yet. We're not to the point where an Airbus can come in and then back out, and then a Boeing aircraft can come in and then back out. We're not there. Everything right now is totally unique. So there's very little interoperability. And if we're going to be efficient about new spaceports coming online, we need to start looking at interoperability. And that's going to be some combination of federal support, probably ASTM, the type of groups who set standards, and the companies themselves who don't want to cooperate. If you're old enough to remember VHF versus Beta, video recorders, or even nowadays, Apple versus Samsung connections, right? People don't like to cooperate because if they feel like they have a competitive advantage, they don't want to give that competitive advantage away. So I think those are two things would really help.
I had a question regarding, usually you think of port, you think of liftoff, right? But also landing, you had mentioned BARDA as returning payloads from space. Where's the value add in returning to land versus sea? From a company's perspective, typically?
From my understanding, I'm not one of the launch providers, but the biggest one is you don't soak your equipment in salt water for hours or longer. It's also, it can be kind of a rough ride, depending on the weather, and it is really safe, right? You have a really big spot to hit, but these systems that are coming in, like Boeing, is kind of a precision landing almost with a Starliner. They've gotten really good. And you can get to it quickly. And so if you talk about a company like BARDA that might be manufacturing drugs in space or other materials, the idea is that you can get it on the ground, get there quickly, you can get the payload out and do whatever you need to do to the payload. Whereas if you're over in the ocean, it's expensive, right? You got ships, you got helicopters, there's a lot to that. So we think we're in a good position to help on that side as well, whether it's going to be use of the runway, for a company like Radian, who we've talked to a few times, who is trying to develop a horizontal system, or a company like BARDA that's working strictly on capsules. But yeah, landing in the ocean has worked for years, but keep in mind that the Russians have also landed on land for decades and decades. We think we got a good spot for that. That's one thing New Mexico has is land. So we think we're in good shape.
Thank you.
That's such
Yeah. Speaking of
Go
New
ahead,
Mexico, I was just going to say I had the chance to participate in the Space Law Conference that was held in Albuquerque in earlier this year, February, I think. But I didn't realize, the burgeoning community that is in New Mexico, not just space, but also the entertainment industry. Like, it's really kind of an interesting. There's a lot going on there. How do you see that progressing? Like, let's say in the next 5 years, like, what do you see happening in the next 5 years, just in New Mexico alone? Because I think it's a great example of like what Michigan could become for, that I'm currently in Detroit and seeing sort of the similar thing. There's a big space community starting to build up here. And as you said, they want to build a spaceport here. What does the next 5 years look like?
Well, that's a great question. New Mexico goes way back in terms of space. Robert Goddard came out to Roswell and launched the first liquid engines, the rocket engines. And of course, under Operation Paperclip, the Allies, captured or the folks surrendered from Nazi Germany. And we had Werner von Braun out at White Sands Proving Ground, as it was called then. So we have this history of space. We also have the NASA White Sands test facility, which is part of Johnson Space Facility. So they tested the lunar engines from Apollo. They do all the materials testing for anything that goes in space to make sure it doesn't outgas. And then a little bit south of us, and now in current time, even that site still exists, we have really good universities. We have University of Texas, El Paso, with something called the Aerospace Center. If you go a little further south, we got Van Horn, Texas. We got Blue Origin is doing the same thing as Virgin Galactic, which is a little bit north. We got New Mexico State University with a great mechanical aerospace program, UNM, University of New Mexico Tech, But then we also have Los Alamos Laboratory, National Laboratory, one of the Department of Energy crown jewels. We have Sandia National Laboratory, another crown jewel. We have Air Force Research Laboratory and Space Force and at Kirtland Air Force Base. So we're in this really unique corridor that is burgeoning in space. And then right in the middle of it, we have a spaceport that is, really well located in terms of airspace and being in a remote population area, so we can do all sorts of things. So, like I said, 5 to 10 years, I'm hoping we start supporting orbital launch and we start supporting reentry. And we're never going to be as big as the Cape, but you need a support system for all that. You need payload processing, you need rocket processing, you need commodities production, and so I think we're in a good spot for that. So in the next 5 years, we're going to see Virgin Galactic launching twice a week, which will add a lot to the element. If you want to come watch a Virgin Galactic launch, it'll be like the Cape. You don't have to look for the date. You just come out and hopefully you'll see one. But then working on these other systems, these newer systems that will be able to launch inland, that's what I think will happen, and that will be very exciting.
Awesome.
That was great. Well, Scott, thank you so much for being part of the Rocket Girl Report. I think from now we're going to keep Scott in, but also transition to our next guest. Ubaldo, if you want to introduce Laura Winter, we're so happy to have her join us as well.
Yes, I'm very excited. Laura, as always, it's great to see you. So Laura Winter is the editor and host of the award-winning Downlink podcast. I definitely recommend this podcast to anyone who is interested in really understanding the business of space and national security. And she spends a lot of time with some key figures throughout the industry, really digging in deep to a lot of the questions that we have to answer. So it's really great. You can subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. Laura, hi.
Hey, man. It's great to see you. What's going on?
Too. Hey, you're coming in at a great time. I mean, I immediately thought of you for this conversation because you do have such great access to, a lot of people, right, who are dealing with these questions every day. And so to you, my first question is, what is at the meat of this? What's at the core of why we need to have this conversation as an industry, navigating, the politics, but doing it, in a way that, keeps us on mission, on task as a human race. We all have this very altruistic, we want to go to space. The reason a lot of us are in this is because we believe humanity is meant to move on, right, through the universe. So how do we do that, but balance the obvious need for political conversations and policies and all those sorts of things?
I think it's really important for the audience. And Scott, unmute yourself so you can correct me if I'm wrong, okay? Because it could be, and I don't mind being corrected. But I really feel that we're at this really interesting inflection point, right? We have the prime contractors, those that have done space for the decades, those that were involved in the Apollo program, those that were involved in the Mercury program. They're still out there. They're still making money hand over fist, and they are considered primes. And these primes have contracts with K Street folks to go and do their bidding on the Hill, right? And we were talking about, Scott just said, there's really been not a whole lot of love for spaceports from the federal government. Well, there is a whole lot of love for Lockheed Martin. There is a whole lot of love for Boeing. There is a whole lot of love for Rocketdyne. I mean, there is money being spent, but we're at this, as I said, this really interesting inflection point. So we've had these primes for the decades, but now we have this new, burgeoning, exciting, cutting-edge technology space ecosystem that is developing in pockets around the United States. And some pockets are bigger than others, right? I mean, the pocket in Florida is obviously big. I mean, we've got people like Chris Quilty of Quilty Space, who is a market analyst. He's based there. Why? Because that's a really big pocket of all these different kinds of companies, both primes and the startups. But then we look at New Mexico, or we look next door from New Mexico into Arizona. There are all these different companies that are bringing technologies to the table, right? Some of them are in Silicon Valley and they have access to things like the Defense Innovation Unit and are able to tap into their money. But the real difference between the old, dare I say that, primes, right? Because back in the day, they were challenged. They were challenged and money was put behind that challenge to do the Mercury program, to do the Apollo program. And there was this great vision that drove things, from President Kennedy initially, probably inspired by Sputnik. But, it carried on into the next administration, and then the administration after that, right? Until about 1972 was the last Apollo launch. It was Apollo 17 to the near side. And since then, the primes have had a pretty cushy space, but their whole business model on how they get those federal dollars has also shifted. And as part of them getting those federal dollars, they have teams of people that go up to the Hill and hang out with the policymakers. They hang out in NASA. They hang out in the DoD. They hang out in the congressional cafeteria, right? And why? Because they're doing business, they're advocating, they're saying these things we need, and they're looking to solve problems. It's not just about selling their widgets. I mean, they are actually reacting to demand signals from NASA and demand signals from the Department of Defense, as well as their own widgets. The thing is, with the new burgeoning cutting edge technology companies, right? Some of them are bootstrapping. Some of them could be considered small businesses. Some of them could even be considered medium-sized businesses. But what they don't have is a real organized advocacy where the checks are signed. They do go in through front doors, like at Space Force, Space Systems Command, and they get contracts. So it's not like, they just don't get federal dollars. They do. Right. And that's a really big, important part of them being able to raise money. So on an individual basis, these smaller, medium-sized, and bootstrappers do get federal dollars. But if we're talking about what we're talking about in this group, which is really pushing out, really getting to the next stage, there really isn't an organization or a collective or something that's really going onto the Hill and really pressuring, or going to the White House and really pressuring, because we can see how slow things move. And it's not that we have to move slowly. It's because we're kind of forced to act like pedestrians as opposed to, marathon runners. Right. And so that's something that I think the community really needs to digest, and also needs to come up with a solution for, because as long as they keep with the status quo, the big chunks of federal dollars are going to go to the squeaky wheels. And the squeaky wheels are the ones that have representation, are able to push the case.
Yeah, that's such a good point. We almost have to play the game, those of us on that side of it, right? The cutting edge innovation, smaller companies. We talk about that all the time at Cislunar Industries, about having lobbyists or having someone who is familiar with navigating that world, because it is almost necessary. So, like, when does it not become necessary? I mean, it's probably a money question, but I mean, or is it always a necessary thing? And that's kind of a question to both of you. Like, is this always going to be a necessary part of what we're trying to do? Because it doesn't necessarily seem like that for all industries.
I'll answer real quick. If you go back just a few decades, going to space was almost entirely a federal occupation, right? It was a federal initiative, and whether it was weather satellites or cargo or the space station, but a whole new marketplace has developed. 98% of the launches at the Cape used to be only government, and now something like 95% are commercial. And even where they're federal dollars, there's still lots of federal dollars embedded in a lot of those launches, but it's a taxi ride. So the things that Laura's talked about, though, still play, especially once we see Blue Origin launch and more of the Vulcan. Like, those are the big players who are going to go and make sure the ride happens on their rocket. But what about the smaller guys? How are they going to get a piece of the pie? This is an age-old tale. It doesn't matter what the technology is or really what the marketplace is. It's an age-old tale, and unfortunately for the small guys, spaceports like us included, we have to learn how to play that game, which is probably 5,000 years old. how to talk to the right people in the right place at the right time. And, the SLS is a good example. You go way back when and you look at the shuttle, there's probably really good reasons why the shuttle parts were made all around the country. Just the same reason there are NASA centers scattered around the country, because you can get support of those representatives, those senators and representatives. And the SLS lives, which is kind of a part of the shuttle program, but it's not all that modern. And is that the best way to get to the moon? We could argue that point, but they know how to play the game, right? They've got lots of people with lots of jobs in lots of states, and they've done a real good job making sure that those dollars flow. So unfortunately, I think the new folks like Cislunar, like Spaceport America, we got to learn to play the game too. I think that's the way it's played in Washington. And I'll go hang out more in the cafeteria with Laura. We'll see who we can talk to.
I'll buy lunch, man.
Well, that actually brings up a good point around space heritage, because also I think there's like a safety concern there too, right? And a legacy feeling of like, well, if you haven't proven it in space, then we're not going to go with you. We're not going to buy your stuff. Which is, again, I think a big reason why a lot of the primes continue to, move as they do. And to your point, Laura, they're making money and they're selling their stuff because they have that experience, that heritage. We barely have it. And so that's a political thing, I feel like. It's so, okay, well, I understand that, but you also have a backlog of this for years. Like how do we ever expect to get past that? How do we expect to speed things up with things like that, with like the space heritage concern?
Well, that's going to be, again, unlocking some of these federal programs, and also for the commercial space community to be creative in seeking out opportunities, right, within these different systems. There's also another part of it, just to give credit where credit is due. I mean, you have a lot of primes, right? They're prime contractors. Why is that? Because they take on the whole responsibility of delivery. And then what they do is they go out and they look for other companies to bring them the widgets they need for them to assemble, or they may even contract out the actual assembly of the thing that the government wants, or even a commercial player for that matter, just to be perfectly honest, right? Because that happens. And they pull it together. So in those sort of opportunities, there are opportunities for smaller companies through prime contracts to get that space heritage. But I really, really, really think it's important to go back to something that Scott just said, and something that we're kind of alluding to here a bit. That's vision, right? So when we're thinking about space heritage now, and space heritage is important because it's taxpayer dollars. So if you're doing it for NASA, you don't want things to, go lopsided, because that's taxpayer dollars, though SLS is whatever, and Starship, yeah, one of those things. But, okay, so it's good that we have more than one launch system. And the same thing goes for Space Force, right? When they have a contract to launch something, they do want something to have space heritage so that they know that they can depend on it, right? It's big deals, taxpayer dollars, got to take care of it. Don't just throw it out the window for fun, right? But they do, both of these organizations, and also across the DoD, like if you're thinking about the Space Development Agency, or you're thinking about things in the intelligence community, there are all these programs that small businesses or bootstrappers can link into, SpaceWorks being one of those, right? Where they can get seed money and show that government has interest, right? And that then shows investors or venture capitalists that, hey, you know what? Government put out a demand signal. This company answered it. It doesn't have space heritage, but we think it's got some legs. And therefore, then venture capitalists come in. All that is well and good. So it's like this big sort of soup of really cool stuff that's going on, but we're not reaching critical mass. Mm-hmm. Why are we not reaching critical mass? And again, I'm going to go right back to what Scott said, because of vision. This is something that has, been stated out of the State of the Space Industrial Base for years, which, by the way, everybody, is a government-funded report. So it's not like the government's, not aware, and it's not like legislators aren't aware, because they do read it, which is why all these people come from all over the place to come and participate to help shape this report. But when you think about Apollo, you think about, okay, well, how did we get to the moon? Because at the time, all the primes, present day primes, they didn't have space heritage. We rolled the dice, man. We rolled big money dice, big cojones dice, and said, we're going to go get some space heritage, and we're going to do this step by step, but we're going to do it in a way that builds upon getting towards the goal of this vision, right? And the vision has to come from leaders, and those are political leaders. And I know you kind of want to stay away from political leaders, but I don't think you actually can, to be honest, because it's going to take political leadership to construct a vision that cuts across parties, which I think space generally has probably one of the best chances of cutting across parties out of everything, right? Because it's all of us. I mean, NASA is the most successful agency of all time for how it spent its money, really, for its return on dollars. So this can be, quite easily multi-party, cross the aisle, love and joy, everyone's farting rainbows and unicorns, right? This can happen, but it can't happen without political leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think, we are, really behind, because if you look at other folks that are, or folks, I shouldn't say that, other spacefaring nations that are out there doing stuff, they have political leadership on space innovation. So we're obviously going to look at China. China, big time. She wants to go, Xi Jinping, head of China, right? He sees space and getting to the moon and well beyond. They have a plan for the solar system. That is vision, man.
Wow.
It's vision. They have a pathway about how they're going to use the assets in the solar system to build their economy and also build their ability to extend their military power. No joke. And it is about military power, because if you go to a launch, reporters who go to these launches, Western reporters, remark on how all the posters around say how space is part of national defense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is a thing. Okay, so you put China over there. Well, India, same thing, right? The head of India, Narendra Modi, sees it being in space as a critical key to them getting ahead. And in the past, 2 years, they have written new laws, new policies, government private partnerships for incubators. They have a vision. They are also going to the moon, and they are pulling out the stops and cutting the red tape to make it happen so that their small businesses, bootstrappers, can get that space heritage, because they need it too, because they're also flying on taxpayer dollars, just Indian ones, right?
Sure.
Another really interesting example, and then I'll stop giving examples, but this is actually, I think, truly interesting. South Korea, President, is it Sun Yuk-sol, right? He ran on the idea of bringing South Korea into a leadership position in space. Why? Because he knows that any nation that is going to be a first nation is going to have to be a space leader. And he delivered. South Korea now, just for 3 months or so maybe, has a space agency. They now have contracts with Saudi Arabia to start an incubator for space bootstrappers. It's leadership that can really shift or put the thumb on the scale and make things go in the way of going forward. So it's political. It just is.
I think that's a great way to put it, Laura. And the next question I have kind of for both of you, I think that segues perfectly into, we've got that election coming up. What do we need from our leadership moving forward with this next administration to really accomplish these goals? I mean, what do you both see has got to be a big focus, and a focus that has to happen now, not, 2-3 years in?
I'll start. I mean, if you go back and you look at, I think some of the political errors and the congestion, you find that a lot of it revolves around technology and understanding technology, whether it's trying to figure out how to regulate, the internet, and now we're trying to figure out how to regulate, if we should regulate social media. We've got some issues, and I think a lot of those issues revolve around the fact that so many of our politicians are lawyers, and they're just not to the point where they can understand the technology that's in front of them. Artificial intelligence is befuddling, right? Do you regulate artificial intelligence? What do you do with artificial intelligence? And space has always been a problem that when it had a political motivation, like going to the moon to beat the Soviets, they didn't need to understand the technology. What they understood was that there was a politics behind it, and they needed to win that politics, that political game. And right now, there's really not a lot of politics in space. We go to the moon, that'd be great. It would be great to beat the Chinese, but at the same time, our society is becoming more and more dependent on the satellite networks, the communications, the things going on in space. But there's not a political motivation for the legislators to really think about it. So on the DoD side, they are thinking hard about it, but that taps back into what Laura said, that they need reliable launch. They like reliable systems, reliable launch sites. So even though DIU, Defense Innovation Unit, and DARPA can be very entrepreneurial at times, that again, they're kind of focused on the older way of doing this, letting the new ways sneak in, but it's just not moving very quick. So to answer your question, we either need, presidential candidates and vice presidents or other politicians who understand what those technology implications are going to do to society. I mean, the reason we argue about healthcare and health insurance is because we have healthcare. We didn't argue about it 100 years ago when you went to the barber to have them do something right. We argue about it because we literally can do so many things, but do we manage it very well? No. But space is the same way. Do our politicians really understand space? Do they understand where we're going to be, what the benefits are going to the moon or being in orbit? So if they're not going to understand it, then they need to find somebody who could. I think one thing about Vice President Pence is he did a good job, I think, on the Space Council, getting it fired up and getting experts into a room to talk about that strategy. And I think we've missed some of that in the last few years. So the question will be, what happens with whoever gets in office, in a few months, where we'll get that vision that Laura talked about, where they're trying to bring together all the nation's needs and figure out how we strategize and prioritize what needs to go forward.
I'm actually going to push back on the whole thing of having to be expert on space. The reason I say that in terms of a leadership role, or that it needs to be a lawyer, or shouldn't be a lawyer, is because Kennedy was a lawyer. That's thing number one, right? Thing number two, I think what actually is more critical is something that's in your character, that's in a leadership character. And that is the idea of being curious and also wanting to lead, right? I agree with you on the lawyering thing, that it kind of pulls you back because you don't want to touch some third rail and get zapped. That's true. That definitely is a lawyerly type of character. But you don't get into politics because it's safe, right? I mean, seriously. I mean, if the lawyers that are political appointees or running for office, like Harris, I mean, if she wanted to be safe, I mean, she could have her own law firm. That's safe, right? This is not safe. Running for president is not safe. So I do think it's something more about character. And this is where I want to circle back to what you said about Pence, because Pence definitely is not a space expert. He is now, but when he took this on, he certainly was not. And that's okay, because what he had in his character was was desire, passion, curiosity, right? And this is where things get kind of dark for this past administration. And I really don't mean this politically. I'm just sharing data. That's it. Okay. I'm a reporter. That's what I do. I look at the data, and the data is pretty stark, right? So under the Trump administration, Mike Pence was the chairman of the Space Council. Mike Pence convened 8 meetings. Under the Biden administration, Harris has conducted 3 meetings, right? And that's really because it's by law that a meeting has to be held once a year. So we're still missing the 2024 meeting, because the last meeting that the Space Council met at was in December of 2023. It was in the last 10 days of the year, right? And so you just got to wonder, what's going on? And just to kind of take the sting out of what I just said a little bit, and I think something that people also really misunderstand. When you're a vice president, you don't actually get to decide where you go and what you do. You're not number 1. You're number 2. When you're number 2, the president signs off on what you're going to do. That person, the president, is the ultimate scheduler, right? The ultimate one who sets the agenda. So I really don't want to lay this at the feet of Harris that she didn't convene more, because honestly, from the folks that I have been talking to, it hasn't really been up to her. Mm-hmm. That's my understanding, right? Or people push back on it when I say, hey, what's going on here? Is she interested or not? And this is where things get kind of interesting. Because, and again, about leadership and vision and desire and passion for space, and why we need leaders who have that, is that when you take a look at the State of the Union address, right? Biden had this amazing opportunity to talk about space, to really bang the drum, bring out the horns, let's have a party about US and space, because on February 22nd, Intuitive Machines, a private company, well, actually publicly traded, but a private, it's not part of the government, it's commercial, right? Publicly traded commercial company, landed on the moon. It was the first time that anything American touched the moon in over 51 years. The last time that we touched down was December of 1972. Right. And I looked back, Biden got caught up in the whole State of the Union speech. He spoke off the cuff, and he had some back and forth. It was really interesting, and it was kind of cool and all that. But, so you can kind of excuse him for maybe not mentioning space. But when I looked at the prepared remarks, those are the speech writers. This is the place where you get the policy wonks from your National Security Council, Space Council, Kamala Harris, everybody, the whole of everybody comes in and tries to pull together a speech. There is one mention of the word space, and it has nothing to do with anything above the Kármán line. It has to do with mortgages and square footage, right? And that is a problem. However, on the positive side, this is where I think there may be a difference in Vice President Harris's acceptance speech for the nomination at the party, right, in Chicago, right, the convention, the DNC convention. She did mention space above the Kármán line. And she did mention it that she will work to ensure that the United States remains in a leadership position. That's a tall order, because that will take vision. Anyway,
is that where we as a community come in? I mean, how much? Because I get what you're saying. It's like sales 101, right? It's like, leadership. They're the ones who make the final decision.
Yeah.
But how much can we all come together to influence that vision, right? And what's the possibility of that, right? She made this statement, great. I know Trump's made statements about space policy and things like that. They've all made these statements. How do we then, and there's lobbying and things like that, but overall as a community, I mean, what else can we do besides landing on the moon? To your point, like, what else is it that we can do as a community to come together to influence those politics without necessarily becoming the politicians ourselves, to kind of bring it back to the sort of the title of this episode?
I think, space is sort of a victim of its own success in a lot of ways. Not that many years ago, there were a few politicians, and I think there's still some around, who are saying, well, we need to get rid of the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration because we can just watch the Weather Channel, not realizing all the data comes from government sources. And, and I think the same thing goes on around our lives right now, whether it's precision navigation and timing and GPS and communications and all the things we do in space. It's seamless, right? And the Starlink is making it even more seamless. I haven't used Starlink yet from SpaceX, but the people that have, who put them on their RVs or their houses, or in some cases now phones, they don't think about the fact that there's thousands of satellites up there and hundreds of ground stations and rockets that had to take off. They just pick up the phone and make a call or just get on the internet. It's that idea that we have to start looking at it as important infrastructure of our lives, just like plumbing or electricity, that we do kind of focus on from time to time because bad things happen, and all the people in North Carolina right now really miss their power. People in Texas a few years ago during the winter missed their power, right? But we don't have anything bad happen in space with the infrastructure. There's been delays in a few things, but people don't realize how dependent their modern lives are. So what can we do? I think a podcast like this, awareness. We need to keep making people aware that this is not just a fun little, let's go to the moon or send somebody on a space tourism flight. Even if it is a really cool one that goes around the North Pole, but people don't realize how dependent our modern society is on everything that's going on in space right now. But the politicians need to know that whether they're lawyers or engineers or whatever their background is, somehow they have to understand that. And I think a lot of them don't. They think the internet is a bunch of tubes. So I think the awareness. Us doing this is a part of that, part of answering your question, Ubaldo.
I think, to foot stomp on that, something that Scott just said that was really critical, and I'm going to keep using the word critical, and critical infrastructure, right? We have 16 critical infrastructure sectors, national critical infrastructure sectors, right? Space systems is not one of them. Yet all of our critical infrastructure sectors depends on space, which they like to use and say, oh, well, that means space is sort of covered. No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean that at all, actually. It means no one's in charge if things go sideways. That's a real problem. And to be perfectly honest, I know I keep going back to the lobbying, but for instance, I was on the Hill on Monday with a group of people that were making a presentation to Hill staffers. Maybe it isn't just going up and hanging out in the cafeteria and trying to get the ear of the representative, though that would probably be more efficient. It is going to have to be about, finding those opportunities, making those opportunities to talk to those who are at least part of the staffs of those who have the purse strings, right? Assailing the White House can be kind of tough, to be honest, especially if you don't have an administration of whatever name, whatever stripe, that isn't particularly interested. We also need, leaders that have vision. I mean, take a look, Jim Bridenstine, right? I think he would have done that no matter who was in charge if he was ahead of NASA. And he really brought that vision. He's the one who said, in 2020, by this time, right? Okay. We need leaders that are also in charge of these things, that are in charge of NASA, or that are in charge of the space portfolio for the Department of Defense. that are willing to tell legislators, hey, we need to do this because, and this is how it's going to affect your constituents, both positively and negatively. But there needs to be a somewhat of an education campaign. It does need to be somewhat organized. I would say, I would advise that it needs to be organized. It needs to be done at a cadence, right? Because it's okay. They come through and they talk about these cute, neat things, right, in space. And then they go back to their lives, and then somebody comes around in 6 months and does another thing. No. There needs to, just like we were talking about launch cadence, we need to talk about information cadence, schooling cadence, but to those who actually support those that make decisions, right? So that it is rising up from the bottom, so that it is more organic. And here's something I also really want to foot stomp from what Scott said. It's not even just about the stuff that we depend on now, right? GPS, our phones, the internet, et cetera, all these things, agriculture, right? I mean, right, biologist man? I mean, green man, right? How much space plays a role in that? We know that. Hard stories to sell. And if you're local, then you should start talking to your local radio station, your local newspaper, because if you do it local, then you can act global. But here's some other things that come out of lessons learned that Scott just said about, having a spaceport. What would happen if Cape Canaveral went flat, right? That's a really, really good point. That's a really important point that I have never heard before. And that is something that folks on the Hill really need to hear. What does that matter? Why does that matter? Why is that so important? Why do we need to diversify? Why is it the Space Force sees it and you all aren't funding it? Space Force doesn't have money unless Congress gives it to them. Even if Space Force sees it, they can't do anything without the money. But here's another one. Space-based solar power, for instance. You're talking about energy, right? And this kind of just go with me on this journey for a minute, because I've actually covered disasters. Because before my time in space, I was out in the wild, wacky world of being a war reporter, and I lived in Afghanistan for 9 years. And one of the stories I reported on was something that really originated next door, and that was the Kashmir earthquake. It was awful, right? But this is what I learned. So I'm going up into Kashmir on the Pakistan side. And yes, lots of people died. They were buried under the buildings. You could smell them. It's pretty awful. But that wasn't really the end of the horror or end of the death. Most people survive the event. They don't survive after the event. Why is that? Because they don't have energy. They can't get clean water. Sewage isn't taken away. Their hospitals are closed. There are no incubators for babies. There's no life-saving, heart electricity thing going on. There's no lights for surgery. There's none of that. Everybody has to be evac'd out, and there's a line, and it's really long. And that's how people die. So space-based solar power could be one of those things that actually saves lives, American lives, as well as lives all over the world. And that's what I'm talking about. Like, how do you bring this alive,
right,
to those decision makers to see the vision and grab onto it?
That's so powerful.
Daniel, yeah, and I was
Oh,
going to say,
sorry.
Daniel, like,
Yeah.
no, I was just going to say, like, Daniel, like the science. So, I mean, that's a great. I'd love your perspective on that, like the science, right? And how do we use the innovation that's happening with food security? The space-based solar power is a perfect one. How, Daniel, have you used that, or have you seen or thought about how to bring that into this conversation as a way to push the narrative?
Yeah, I think, science is about imagining new possibilities of the future. And space really embodies that. whether you're talking about human exploration, how to live off planet, how to live with limited resources, or whether you're trying, or right, the profit is often prestige, whether you're talking about a nation state level or a workforce development. Now you had the pride of engineers and all the cigarette butts to prove that when those Apollo landers were landing, that they landed and they took off again. So there's a lot of prestige both at the personal level. It drives innovation. It's really about living, essentially in the future, imagining new possibilities of the future, and again back to that vision element. Now, one of the challenges I see with I mean, it's great from a workforce development standpoint, from a national pride standpoint. Those are kind of the primary profits. What I've seen a little bit more is like the dilution element of these commercial activities. Is companies now, back in the Apollo age, it wasn't really, they weren't making the decisions based off balance sheets necessarily. Now it seems increasingly important, both you drive innovation by having these commercial startups that are imagining new possibilities, but at the end of the day, it comes back down to balance sheets. And is there too much dilution there to actually sustain all these blue sky ideas that are all trying to bud out? Is innovation still happening at the commercial level, or is it happening within NASA? You kind of ask the young people, what do you want to do, that are interested in space? And you get like two kind of responses. It's almost like, are you into cooking or baking, right? All the people that like cooking say SpaceX. All the ones that like baking like want to work for NASA. That's the lab-based experiment. So, it's two types of mentalities for innovation. Do you want more basic iterative science, or do you want more exploratory entrepreneurial science? So that's my very broad view on science coming into space in the future here.
If I could throw in one thing, you have SpaceX who got someplace a lot quicker than anybody thought they would, right? In terms of creating a marketplace. And besides launch, one of the marketplaces they created was Starlink, which people had already tried. We had Iridium that goes way, way back, but they could hardly ever be profitable. And then Starlink comes in, and some people say that Starlink's going to make more money for SpaceX than rocket launch makes for SpaceX, right? So they created their own marketplace, and they're going to profit from that. I think those are going to be key drivers. We talked about what's happening in the next 5 to 10 years. Another key driver is believe it or not, artificial intelligence. If you go and you look at the amount of power, the electrical power, the demand that is going to be needed for what we humans want to be able to do on our phones and our laptops for artificial intelligence, it doesn't exist. That amount of power does not exist in the United States. It doesn't exist in China. It doesn't exist around the world. Here we are trying to meet our carbon goals, and we invented a new technology which is going to double the amount of power we need in the United States. It's crazy. But space is an answer, with a little latency, you can put, huge amount of solar panels up in space. You can put the data server farm up in space. It can cool itself up there. It's easy to cool stuff up there. Space is cold. Here's an interesting application of space, but it's going to take a lot of launches to get that many solar panels and that many, NVIDIA chips up in orbit. But that's an interesting place where this is going to go, and that plus manufacturing, even space tourism of all its different kinds, that is where space is headed, where 95% of the marketplace is going to be commercial, not government. So even though we talk about a vision, it's more about government trying to figure out what the guardrails are and making it so these private companies have a place they can go with some reliability in terms of how to enter that marketplace and put those dollars to work that Laura talked about.
Yeah, this is great. I mean, I think Ubaldo and Daniel and I can agree this was a conversation that needed to be had. And, we brought up some good things today, and clearly moving forward, it'll be interesting after the election to kind of see where things go. So we are actually out of time for today, but I'm sure we could continue this conversation for hours more. And so Laura, Scott, thank you so much for joining us for this week. And for those of you watching, hey, join the conversation, comment below, send us some messages, and we'll provide Laura and Scott's information if you want to connect moving forward. But from all of us here, Daniel, Ubaldo, we're really glad that you joined us for this month. Let's continue the conversation by having these conversations and making a difference in the world of space.